seeking a justice. President Trump is talking to lawmakers and others about candidates for the opening on the Supreme Court. 6-month checkup. The president is hailing his tax cuts, why some charities aren't sharing his enthusiasm. Troops of St. George. Why a group in Texas considers itself a Catholic alternative to the Boy Scouts. And adding color to his work. Why one tailor in Rome has been particularly busy this week. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, June 29, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. President Trump may select his next Supreme Court nominee within the next couple of weeks. The retirement of Justice Anthony Kennedy creates a dilemma for Democratic senators up for re-election this year in states President Trump won in 2016. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi is following the story. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. Yeah, Republicans have little wiggle room. They have just the number of senators needed to confirm a Supreme Court justice, 51. But Senator John McCain is at home sick. So President Trump is meeting with senators whose votes are seen as most up for grabs. That's 3 Democrats, Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Manchin, and Joe Donnelly, and then 2 supporters of abortion on the Republican side, Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska.
That's the group that will determine the outcome, I think, of this, the upcoming nomination.
Former Senate Judiciary Insider Tom Jipping says the president's meeting probably was not a negotiation to get their votes.
He's obviously already appointed a Supreme Court justice. I wouldn't expect his second nominee to be much different, but I think he wanted to share with those senators who, really could make the difference what his perspective is on choosing nominees.
To choose his nominee, the president will meet top contenders.
I think that he probably has questions about their past, their history, their academic credentials, questions about things that they've written. But as we've talked about, there's not a litmus test or particular questions about X, Y, or Z case.
One name on that list, appeals court judge Amy Barrett. During her confirmation hearing, she was targeted for her Catholic faith.
The dogma lives loudly within you, and that's of concern.
Like Barrett, Indiana Democrat Joe Donnelly also graduated from the University of Notre Dame, where Barrett taught law and Donnelly's wife works. He's facing a tough re-election bid in a state Trump won. And to win on-the-fence Senate Democrats like Donnelly,
there's another opening, a chance to appoint another great justice.
Conservatives launched this $1 million ad campaign.
Extremists will lie and attack the nominee. But don't be fooled. President Trump's list includes the best of the best.
The White House's liaison with Congress, Mark Short, says he hopes that the confirmation hearings will happen this summer. And then when Congress comes back from their Labor Day recess, he's hoping to have the actual confirmation vote. That sets us up so right across the street, the brand new Supreme Court justice can take his seat at the bench, a lifetime appointment, just in time for the Supreme Court's term to open in October. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. President Trump celebrates the 6-month anniversary of his Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. He touts economic growth and low unemployment as the results of the legislation, but Catholic bishops remain concerned the law will have a negative impact on the poor. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Bishops say government programs serving low-income people will be cut as a result of the tax law, and that will hurt those most in need. At the same time, President Trump is citing the nation's great economic numbers as a win for families.
We're bringing back our pride, we're bringing back our jobs, we're bringing back our wealth.
President Trump says he really is making America great again. For example, he announced the unemployment rate for women is near an all-time low.
Our country finally has a tax system that is pro-jobs, pro-worker, pro-family, and pro-American.
The White House says the overall unemployment rate has fallen to 3.8%, the lowest level in nearly 50 years. Job openings also reached a record high of 6.7 million in April. That means there are more job openings than job seekers for the first time on record.
What we know right now is that the economy is humming along.
Shaya Akabus, Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, recognizes the growth, but says the U.S. is in the 9th year of an economic recovery that started under the Obama administration and has continued under Trump.
Pinpointing how much of the strong growth we see right now is from the tax cut is very difficult. So it's a story that's starting to unfold, but it's going to continue to unfold for months and years to come.
And what about the U.S. bishop's concern for the poor? Agabus says an increase in federal spending combined with lowering taxes means the government may have to cut spending to programs that help low-income Americans.
Where these cuts will come from and how these tax cuts that we saw last year will be paid for is an open question that could really come back and have these adverse impacts on the populations that the bishops are talking about.
The Conference of Catholic Bishops said changes to the tax law could cut charitable giving by $13 billion a year. The expert I spoke with says they may be right. Since the tax code raised the standard deduction, fewer people need to itemize their taxes, and that takes away an incentive to give to charities. Wyatt?
A lot of things to think about when it comes to this story. White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. President Trump also voiced his support for journalists today. This one day after a gunman stormed into a newspaper office in Maryland, killing 5 people.
Journalists, like all Americans, should be free from the fear of being violently attacked while doing their job. To the families of the victims, there are no words to express our sorrow for your loss.
The president adds his administration will continue working to reduce violent crime. 38-year-old Jared W. Ramos is charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Police say he had a long-standing grudge against the Capital Gazette newspaper in Annapolis, Maryland. The Archdiocese of Baltimore says one of the victims, 56-year-old John McNamara, was a practicing Catholic. He and his wife were active in their parish's pre-K-Nup program. A federal judge temporarily blocks a new pro-life law in Indiana. It requires medical providers report detailed patient information to the state if they treat women for complications arising from abortion. Planned Parenthood is pushing against it, saying the legislation puts burdensome obligations on the doctors. Officials agreed to screen migrants in North Africa to see if they are eligible to enter Europe. The announcement comes on the second day of meeting in Brussels. Countries within the EU have been arguing over who should take responsibility for the tens of thousands of immigrants spilling across their borders and how to solve the problem. Germany says it is sending back migrants who have already registered in Greece and Spain. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel is in a dispute with her own interior minister over the migration crisis. He threatens to send migrants registered to another EU country back to that country, even without Merkel's approval. Greece and Spain have agreed to take back the migrants. Around 100 migrants are missing and feared dead following an accident in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Libya. The Libyan Coast Guard says those on board were trying to reach Europe when smugglers' boat capsized. The United Nations Migration Agency rejects the Trump administration's proposed pick to lead the group. They opt instead for a Portuguese socialist and former EU commissioner. The Trump-backed candidate, an American, Ken Isaacs, says it was an honor for him to have been considered. It will only be the second time since 1951 the group will be led by someone from outside the United States. Isaacs currently works for a Christian nonprofit agency. Vice President Mike Pence delivers a blunt message to 3 Central American presidents. You must do more to stop migrants who enter the United States illegally.
I say with great respect to the presidents gathered here, this exodus must end. It is a threat to the security of the United States.
Present were the leaders of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The majority of migrants detained at the U.S. border are from those 3 countries. Pence adds U.S. officials are working to keep families together, and he welcomes legal immigration from their countries, but adds coming to the United States illegally will only result in a hard journey and a harder life. Spain's lower house of parliament agrees to consider a bill to legalize euthanasia. It was introduced by the Socialist Party. The country's Catholic bishops have spoken out against the measure. Instead, they call for laws respecting life while alleviating pain. Spain is roughly 2/3 Catholic. For more on this story, including a look at the European countries that have legalized euthanasia, please visit our news partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Masked men armed with machetes attack a Catholic chancery in Nicaragua. They stole valuables and damaged furniture. Priests say they are sad, quote, for this desecration of a sacred place. The country has been riled by 2 months of protests against President Ortega. Church leaders are in Rome to update Pope Francis on the situation. The United States moves its military base out of Seoul, ending its 70 years in South Korea's capital. But the U.S. remains committed to maintaining a presence in the country.
And this headquarters building, within the headquarters complex that surrounds it, represents the significant investment in the long-term presence of U.S. forces in Korea.
The new base is 50 miles from Seoul and further from the border with North Korea. The move has been in the works for years. Camp Humphreys cost $11 billion and has more than 3,000 acres. Pope Francis has accepted the resignation of Melbourne, Australia's Archbishop Dennis Hart. He's the Archbishop who said he would prefer jail than breaking the seal of confession. He's 77 years old, 2 years older than the age bishops typically offer their resignation. Last year, the Archbishop said the seal of confession can't be broken after an Australian Royal Commission recommended that priests be required to report cases of child sex abuse heard in the confessional. The issue has caused debate in Australia. Coming up, the State Department is shining the spotlight on what many call modern-day slavery. And a Washington insider talks President Trump and the Supreme Court. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says human trafficking remains a problem in almost every corner of the world. This as the State Department unveils its annual report on trafficking this week and recognizes advocates who are helping in the fight. Secretary Mike Pompeo and presidential advisor Ivanka Trump honored 10 individuals from around the world dedicated to combating modern-day slavery. Pompeo vowing the U.S. is also committed to the fight.
Human traffic is a global problem, but it's a local one too. Human trafficking can be found in a favorite restaurant, a hotel, downtown, a farm, or in their neighbor's home.
Pompeo releasing the State Department's annual Trafficking in Persons report. It ranks governments based on their efforts to eliminate forced labor, sexual slavery, or sexual exploitation. The secretary says among the countries demoted to Tier 3, the lowest category, was Myanmar, also known as Burma.
Burma's armed forces and others in the Rakhine state dislocated hundreds of thousands of Rohingya and members of other ethnic groups, many of whom were exploited through the region as a result. Some in the Burmese military also recruited child soldiers and subjected adults and children from ethnic minority groups to forced labor.
Other countries with Tier 3 status include China, North Korea, and Iran. Those countries could be penalized with sanctions, including the withholding of non-humanitarian aid. One glaring absence to the State Department's presentation, a lack of an ambassador at large for combating trafficking in persons. The former ambassador says it's important to fill that vacancy.
The idea that an ambassador can go out and meet with heads of state, can meet with the foreign ministers, speaks with a certain legal imprimatur of the president and the government, that's important.
The next ambassador at large will likely be briefed on one of the biggest findings in this year's report, which is that children removed from their families and placed in institutional care are at greater risk of being trafficked. Joining me now for more analysis is John Gizzi, White House correspondent for Newsmax. John, welcome back to the program.
Glad to be here, Wyatt. Thank you.
The Trump administration is likely to get some pushback on this report, especially that last point that I mentioned, especially because of its enforcement on that zero tolerance policy, in which kind of separated 2,000 migrants, children from their families. Is that a fair comparison, this human trafficking, to what's going on at the border?
No, and remember something. The separation that's going on in the border comes after people determine the children are not the offspring of the people bringing them over, and that certainly is going to be enforced after the last executive order. In the cases that were in this report, this is government policy to separate children and traffic, the most abominable cases being, as the commentator previously said, North Korea, China, and Iran. On the other hand, the report also hailed governments in 14 countries for working to alleviate this problem, among them Estonia, Bahrain, and Argentina. This is different comparing what is a result of people coming to something that's the official policy of governments and which it countenances.
Okay, so we'll continue to watch the human trafficking situation, but I want to ask you
Certainly.
also about one other top priority for President Trump, of course, that we've been covering this week, and that's finding the replacement for Justice Anthony Kennedy.
Why does that surprise me you brought that up?
Yeah, exactly. It's only the biggest news story, right? So what do you think is going to be the most important for the president in choosing Kennedy's successor?
Well, I think obviously someone who is going to live up to the promises that he made in the third debate with Hillary Clinton, in which he became the first presidential candidate in history to say that his court would overturn Roe v. Wade and return the abortion issue to the states. No one has said that before who's been a major party nominee, and many believe it was key to the kind of support he had that put him over the top. In addition, youth is going to be important. There's many qualified jurists over the age of 60. Unofficially, that's the administration's cutoff point because they want a justice who will be there for a long time.
And of course, this pick has great implications. It could change the whole makeup of the court, change things for decades to come. What do you think the confirmation process will be like? Anticipate a big battle, basically?
Spirited, tumultuous, turbulent. I could come up with some other adjectives if you need them. No, the fact is that confirmations in the modern era are becoming the subjects of campaigns, not unlike a presidential campaign, to some not unlike blood sport. We certainly saw this around the nomination of Neil Gorsuch and around George W. Bush's appointees, Justices Roberts and Alito. Interesting that when President Obama named Justices Sotomayor and Kagan, there was very little opposition from the other side, and Republicans, in fact, in fairly large numbers, voted for Justice Sotomayor because they found no compelling reason or scandal about her, different standards that are there. My guess is that if the nominee the president puts forth is well-spoken in the hearings, demonstrates an understanding of the law, and gives the impression that he or she would be a fair arbiter of any case that came in front of them, much as John Roberts did when he was named, no campaign is going to change the inevitability of confirmation.
We'll be watching. John Gizzi, White House correspondent for Newsmax. Thanks so much for your analysis, sir.
Thanks for having me, Wyatt.
Up next, we hear why a national organization calls itself a Catholic alternative to the Boy Scouts. And a closer look at how a Catholic tailor creates the distinct scarlet attire for the princes of the church. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Pope Francis celebrates the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul today, urging Christians not to run from the cross, but to imitate Christ.
Partecipare all'unzione di Cristo e partecipare alla sua gloria.
Speaking to thousands of the faithful packed into a sun-baked St. Peter's Square, the Holy Father says Christians must embrace the weak and the vulnerable. 26 archbishops who were named in the past year were presented with their pallium. That's the band of white wool worn by metropolitan archbishops as a symbol of their authority and their unity with the Pope. The 14 new cardinals, elevated yesterday, were also there. After Mass, the Holy Father traveled around the square, then headed to the Apostolic Palace. There he prayed the Angelus and addressed the crowd, reflecting on Jesus calling Peter the rock on which the church is built. With the creation of 14 new cardinals comes the need for new attire for the latest princes of the church. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley met the man who makes the cardinals' scarlet vestments.
Hidden away in the heart of Vatican City, behind an unassuming doorway, I find a tailor like no other. Eti Ciccioni used to create high-fashion gowns and robes. Today, his creative focus is on handcrafting cardinals' vestments.
Nell'alta moda si cambia continuamente.
Eti says the world of fashion is constantly changing, but the world of cardinals' vestments hasn't changed in centuries.
Abbiamo la mozzetta.
Pope Gregory X installed scarlet as the color for cardinals in the 13th century.
And Eti, as you just explained to me, there's so much symbolism in this costume. The color, the red, representing the blood that a cardinal would shed to defend his faith. And then these buttons, there are 33 buttons, and they represent the age at which Jesus Christ was crucified.
Special garments are worn for a consistory, including a white rochet, usually made of lace or embroidered linen, a red cape known as the mozzetta, and a rigid biretta, which is worn over the zucchetto, the scarlet skullcap. Assistant Carmelo Candido helps Etty with some of the heavier work, and a lot of the hand stitching and embroidery is outsourced to dedicated seamstresses in Etty's hometown in central Italy. Etty has met Pope Francis twice. Pope Benedict baptized one of his children, and John Paul II gave Etty and his wife their wedding blessing. From top to toe, it takes 4 days to make a cardinal's vestments, and the cost is almost $1,500. The Vatican tailor, who also handcrafts the Swiss Guards' trademark uniforms, says creating clothes that so strongly symbolize the Catholic faith makes his soul soar. At the Vatican, Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly.
A scouting organization for Catholic boys and young men has become an authentic Catholic apostolate of the Diocese of Fort Worth. Bishop Michael Olson gave the Troops of St. George official ecclesiastical approval and his prayerful support. Cardinal Raymond Burke also extended his heartfelt congratulations to the group, which was founded 5 years ago to promote values like virtue, honor, and fraternity. Joining me now is Dr. Jeremy Lustig, Chairman of the Board and National Executive Director of the Troops of St. George. Dr. Lustig, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Wyatt. I really appreciate that.
Membership in the Troops of St. George is exclusively Catholic and exclusively male. Why is it so important to have an organization of this kind today as an alternative to the Boy Scouts?
You know, we feel that the masculine virtues have somewhat been lost, and we've actually created this program to be in the outdoors, in the context of the outdoors, but more specifically to be a father-son organization, just trying to bring back that, you know, that wholesome need for a father and a son to kind of grow in their virtues together.
And there are now more than 1,300 members across the country. What are you hearing from parishes about the impact of the Troops of St. George is having?
You know, we're getting really wonderful responses. The amount of people that are showing interest in what it is we're doing, those that are seeing the fruits of their labors, the fathers and sons, their growth together, it's just been amazing. And the number of stories that keep coming in are just one after another.
You mentioned that the troop outings combine elements of the Catholic faith with outdoor activities. So how do the two complement one another?
You know, it's really, that's the best part of it is, you know, we go out, we get dirty, you know, do the normal rugged things. But at the same token, typically a priest will come on our campouts with us. We have Mass. And then to have your son witness you and other fathers kneel in prayer together around a campfire, it's just one of those moments that you can't duplicate any other way.
And then you also mentioned fathers and sons. Why is it so important to have the fathers actually participate with their sons in this?
You know, it just seems like most organizations today are kind of a drop your child off type of thing. You pick them up and you find out what happened in the day's events, or if you're lucky enough to be maybe the coach on a soccer team, you get to actually experience that with your child. There's very few organizations that actually involve both child and their parent, and this is just a great way to grow in holiness. And in all honesty, this organization is as much about the father and son as it is about the boys. It's really an incredible experience and a bonding moment. And then to be able to do it under the context of our church and you know, glorifying God while we're doing it, it just wraps it all together and just makes it a really wonderful experience.
And as you mentioned, you're getting a positive response by so many parishes across the country. Tell me more about expansion. Is it growing? How fast is it growing? And can you really keep up with demand, if you will?
You know, we were founded here in the Fort Worth, Dallas area of Texas. And we have expanded. There's a huge expansion happening up in the Midwest. Lots of interest from Florida, California, really Arizona. It's just coming across the entire United States. We're having actually a lot of interest across the globe as well. But right now, just in order to get our systems and everything well, and just to, you know, have kind of that controlled growth. We're not about numbers. We're really about quality. And so we're expanding, but we're doing it in a method and at a pace that we can keep up with, because we want this experience, you know, with our goal being to raise holy Catholic fathers, holy sons, and hopefully have a few priests come out of our ranks.
Very good. Well, I know that there's so many people across the country who are praying for the future of your organization. Dr. Jeremy Lustig, Chairman of the Board and National Executive Director of the Troops of St. George, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Finally tonight, school is out and summer is here. But for 830 teenagers in the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia, it is not a time for resting and relaxing. Instead, they've been working on repairing more than 120 homes for needy families in northern and central Virginia. The teens gave up their cell phones and worked in the hot sun. Projects included replacing a roof for a disabled man and weatherproofing windows for a single father of 6. The project also included daily mass. Says one teenager, everyone was enthusiastic and the residents were so appreciative. Well, sounds like a great volunteer effort and a good way to serve others. That wraps up our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We're back Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.